Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to World Civilizations 2, and you should be here for week 6, where we're going to mainly discuss the Industrial Revolution, but also have a bit of a prelude to the Great War. Now, if you've gone through the Moodle class already before coming to this video, you might have noticed that there's only one lecture posted for this week. That's because I decided that since I've been giving you guys pretty long lectures in comparison to some of my other classes, I'd give you a bit of a break this week and only post one, because there really isn't much in your textbook and other readings on the agricultural revolution anyway. So to save time, we're going to focus mainly on just the Industrial Revolution. Don't say I never did anything for you. Now, as always, of course, we'll look at some of the key terms for this week. These are the main things, of course, you need to keep in mind when looking at upcoming assignments. First, we will, of course, look at capitalism, the famous economic system. We'll look at the development of the steam engine and telegraph wires, and we'll also look at suffragettes and mutual defense alliances. Before we get into that, however, I of course do want to make sure you're aware of your upcoming assignments. As you hopefully have already noticed from my frequent emails, your first debate, all those materials are due on October the 2nd at 5 p.m. Now, to be very clear, your debate materials and the alternate assignment are both due on that time. No matter which one you're doing, all debate materials you have are due October the 2nd at 5 p.m. If I haven't been clear enough on this already, I want to make sure to take an opportunity to do that now. You do not have to do the regular debate and the alternate assignment. As long as you filled out the Google Sheet I sent you all a link to, you only have to do just either the live debate or you'll do the alternate assignment. Now, if again, just to be even more repetitive, if you haven't already done so, please do go ahead to that Google Sheet and pick your team and let me know if you'll participate in the live debate. As long as you let me know one way or the other, you will not be penalized for whichever choice you pick. I just need you to pick out the Google Sheet so I can make sure everyone who is going to prepare for the live debate is prepared as soon as they possibly can be. Also, your next content quiz will be due the next Friday after viewing this on October the 9th at 5 p.m. This should be located in the Week 7 folder. Finally, your midterm writing assignment is coming up closer to the end of this month on October the 23rd at 5 p.m. One thing I do want to make sure you all do is please make sure you go ahead and view the prompt and the rubric. Both of these are already on Moodle and actually have been since the beginning of the semester. One thing I've heard from a couple of people is that they felt they weren't quite prepared for the second writing assignment because they just assumed it was the same word count as the first one. That is not the case, and that is especially not the case for the midterm and for your final essay. That's one reason I wanted to make sure the prompts and the rubrics were up on Moodle from the very beginning of the semester. This doesn't mean that I won't be sympathetic and can't be helpful if you do have issues getting things done. I'll do the best I can to be of assistance. But please do remember that you are able to go ahead and have a bit of a plan set in place at the beginning because you do already have the prompt available to view. So please make sure you view all these prompts ahead of time so you're prepared for what is expected when. That way you can have a bit of a work plan set up, how much you're going to get done each day, and you're not waiting until the last minute because you think it's a simpler assignment than it actually is. Please make sure you take advantage of the fact that these have been on Moodle since the beginning of the semester to make sure you're prepared and know what is expected when. However, in the meantime, let's go ahead and get into the Industrial Revolution for a bit. What I want you to consider as we go throughout this lesson is a few questions. First, what were some of the international impacts of the Industrial Revolution? What were some of the benefits and the consequences of the Industrial Revolution spreading European culture and technology throughout the world? That will especially become more relevant as we start discussing imperialism in coming weeks. But in the meantime, why Europe? Historians have identified a few major reasons for why the Industrial Revolution did get its start in Europe. One of the major ones is the emergence of modern capitalism. Can anyone at home tell me what capitalism is? I'll give you a moment to answer at home with an awkward pause. Yeah, and especially in America, this is probably something many of you are acquainted with. Capitalism is a free market economic system where individuals own their own property and own their own businesses, Or as an economist would put it, they own the means of production. They own their own ability to produce goods, and they can determine what to buy and what to sell. This has been credited as helping the Industrial Revolution because it encouraged corporations and companies to compete with each other. If you know anything about capitalism or know many pro capitalist people, one of the main things they'll mention about benefits of capitalism is this competition. But once these companies started competing, they tried to come up with better ways to produce their goods and to get it out to the public, which encouraged many of the developments of the Industrial Revolution. Imperialism was another major impact on the Industrial Revolution. We've talked about this a little bit already. What exactly is imperialism and colonization? I'll give you a moment to think about it at home. While again, I stroke my beard like a James Bond villain. Well, yes, imperialism is colonization, as many of you have probably noticed, is when one country goes and conquers other countries in various places across the world and makes them a part of their growing political organization where they're underneath the country that colonized them. This, of course, as you might imagine, ties into mercantilism and is a big part of why Europe is where the Industrial Revolution took place. Since these European countries were conquering various places across the world, as we've talked about, they set up many plantations, they set up a ton of mines, which gave them a lot of wealth and raw materials to fuel the Industrial Revolution. So they didn't just, so for example, England didn't just have to rely on what resources and labor England had, they could exploit other countries to get the resources they needed. Efforts to mine coal were also a very important idea. This, for example, took place in many European countries, especially Great Britain, because they had already cut down a huge portion of their lumber. They had to turn to coal now for a fuel source, which, if you know anything about the Industrial Revolution, became a big important fuel source for many of the inventions of the Industrial Revolution. Finally, the Agricultural Revolution, which we haven't talked very much about at all, but it was a big idea as well. With a big agricultural surplus, people now had enough food to not worry about starvation, so they can now devote a bit more of their time to inventing things and improving their lives in other areas. So again, essentially, some major civilization improvements and or exploitations managed to converge in Europe, allowing them to create all the inventions associated with the Industrial Revolution. One of the most important of these that I do want to focus on is the steam engine. The steam engine was an engine that began to replace horsepower around the early 1700s in English mines. Now, can anyone tell me what horsepower is? Any of my car fans or car people in here can probably tell me. Not the movie, the actual vehicles, just to be clear. Yes, horsepower, as you could probably guess, is what it literally sounds like. It's how many horses it would take to accomplish some task or to produce some amount of force. The steam engine could now do that on its own without having to rely on horses. For example, in 1698, Thomas Savery made a steam engine for a Cornish mine, which, by the way, does anyone actually know why these engines started off in mines? Actually, I only give a short pause for that one because that's probably not very popular knowledge, but it was actually because these mines would often flood and you needed an engine to help fuel mechanics to pump the water out of the mine. So therefore, they typically got their start there. 1709, Thomas Newcomen built the reciprocating steam engine, which you can see right here in this picture. Now, I won't pretend to understand a ton about mechanical engineering or industry. Why do you think I teach history and not engineering? But this was a more efficient form of the engine, as you can see here, that could produce more things more efficiently than the regular steam engine. By 1768, James Watt had built a distinct condenser, which allowed these engines to be even more efficient. This, of course, led to the invention of steam trains. Steam trains are some of the most important inventions of the 19th century. A couple of benefits of steam trains. Steam trains reduce the cost of transporting goods. Now, why is that going to benefit consumers? Yeah, I'll give you a moment to think about it. And I just realized a little bit, at least from my end, it looks like the steam engine's going through my head. Let me move that out of the way. There you go. But yes, this is really sort of economics 101. If you can cut down on the cost of producing and transporting a good, you can charge less in order to sell it to the public, which means more people are going to be able to buy your product and therefore hopefully drive your prices up. Also, this allowed for a timetable in trade. What exactly does a timetable mean, and why is that going to be a benefit? Yeah, an awkward pause. Sorry. We're going to have to get used to these at some point, right? But yeah, a timetable, again, it just means essentially what it sounds like. Instead of just saying, oh, well, my goods will be to your village or your city or town in so many weeks, so many days, whatever it is, since you had reliable steam trains, you could set up much more strict and much more detailed times on when goods could be expected to arrive. Trading could therefore be much more reliable and much more efficient. Instead of having to wait ages for economic transactions to go through, you could have much more precise details planned out in advance. This made again trade much more efficient, much more dependable and reliable, which encouraged more investment. It also would give armies a military advantage. Why do you think having a railroad is going to be an advantage to the military? Yeah, an awkward pause. Yeah, for those of you who are especially familiar with the American Civil War, which I gave you as an example right here, having railroad lines helps with supplies especially. Instead of again having to rely on more unreliable supply methods like wagon trains and things of that nature, you now have steam engines, which are much more dependable, less likely, harder to stop, much quicker, so you can get supplies at a greater rate. This gave the Union a great advantage over the Confederacy again in the Civil War, and was also a major factor in the France and Prussian War of 1870 and 1871. Because of this increased reliability and speed of transportation, you also have a national newspaper for the very first time. News can now spread much more quickly, and information can be gathered much more quickly, so you start having national newspapers. Also, for one of the first times in American history, cities and cultures became much more interconnected across the world, across the world, not just America. So instead of people essentially developing in isolation, not a lot of communication, this increased the amount of communication between different cities and different countries. So, for example, the first steam train was developed in England in 1825. They reached France by 1828, the United States by 1830, Austria by 1832, and Germany and Belgium by 1835. Steamboats were also developed during this time period with steam engines. They grew in popularity from 1840 pretty much through the rest of the 19th century. Couple of advantages of steamboats. They used less coal to power their engines, so they were much more efficient. They could also sail in windless weather and sail through canals. For example, the Suez Canal was developed in 1869, which connected the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Anyone aware of what the benefits of canals were? And for example, think a little bit about what we've talked about and what some of you mentioned in some of your writing assignments about how the Portuguese explored in Africa. All right. As you might have guessed, again, this is another example of cutting down on the cost and on the time in transporting goods. Instead of, for example, having to sail all the way around Africa to reach portions of Asia to trade, you could now dig canals in between land masses to sail directly through somewhere and get to your destination much more quickly. So again, this is all about cutting down on the cost and increasing the efficiency of trade. Many of the other benefits were essentially the same as a steam engine. Or as a steam train, it's just about transporting on the water instead. Telegraph lines were also a big deal during this time. A telegraph is just a single copper wire which runs along tall posts and or railway lines that uses an electric battery to carry signals. Now, why do you think this would get its start on a railway line? Think about a little bit about what you may have learned in other classes about westward expansion, for example. All right, so yeah, again, after the awkward pause, this is probably a good question for those of you who have taken American history classes before. Railroads, as we mentioned, were great ways to cut back on travel costs, start connected areas more. So essentially, as you can see, for example, in the American West, There are a lot of times some of the first transportation routes being set up for certain areas, so naturally the telegraph lines are going to follow them. And of course, the telegraph will be very useful for these railroad lines to help them communicate between different businessmen and traders. Couple of again the benefits of telegraphs. They were more cost effective and faster than railroads. So instead of having to rely on railroads for transportation and communication, if you just needed to communicate with someone, you could just use a telegraph line. They also, for the first time, allowed for near instant international communication. Instead of having to wait for ships to travel weeks or months to distant locations, you could almost instantaneously send a telegraph. Again, as you might imagine, there were also great military advantages as well. Instead of having to rely on slow communications between armies and their commanders, you could send a telegraph again almost instantly. A couple of examples for how the telegraph started to connect the world. By 1849, there were about 15 kilometers of telegraph lines in America, or we went from 15 kilometers of telegraph lines in America to over 9,000 miles. So obviously a huge increase. By 1850, telegraph lines now existed all the way between England and France, as you can see here. Why would that be such a big deal? Give you a moment to think on it. All right, yes, again, it's an example of that international communication. Instead of having to rely on delayed negotiations and delayed communications, countries could now start to negotiate or communicate almost instantly, which speeds up political processes. By 1866, there was a line between America and London, as you can see here, and by the 1870s, there were lines connecting London with their distant colonies in Australia and all the way down in New Zealand. One of the more interesting examples of this instantaneous communication is the famous Sun Outdone incident of February 16, 1871. When this occurred, there was a telegraph that was sent to London all the way from modern-day Pakistan in just 50 minutes. So this meant that this message covered 9,000 kilometers in just about 15 minutes, all the way back in the 1870s. So now I know this may not seem like a huge deal, and for us in the days of Instagram, iMessaging, and whatever other technology you kids use these days. But this, of course, is much faster than having to wait months for a ship to travel 9,000 miles. You can now send a message in less than an hour. Now that some of those technology advancements are out of the way, I do want to get a little bit into some of the social aspects of the Industrial Revolution as well. As many of you are probably already aware from previous history classes, some of the negatives of the Industrial Revolution are typically associated with labor. So, in order to save time, what I'd like you to do, and of course to encourage your own active learning, if you haven't already done so, please do pause this video and make sure you do the reading on child labor and industrial labor that I posted in Moodle this week, and be prepared to answer these couple of questions for following assignments. First, what are some of the main problems associated with child labor? Why is it such an infamous part of our nation's history and of world history? Second, according to some of these accounts, why was child labor allowed to persist? If child labor is such a terrible thing, why did it occur in this country for so long? It's like slavery. A lot of times we like to talk about how terrible these things were, but that doesn't acknowledge the fact that we let it happen for so long. It's important to understand why people were willing to let these things happen for as long as they did. 3. What sort of struggles did adults, looking at both men and women particularly, experience in the Industrial Revolution labor? It's very easy and it is important to focus on the effects of child labor, but it's also important to recognize that many negative things were associated with the experiences of grown adults as well. On the same vein, I want to look at industrialization and women's rights. Obviously, as you'll see once you finish that reading, which you should have done by now if you paused it, some of the more positive aspects of the Industrial Revolution are the effect on women's rights. As you might guess, because of the amount of jobs available and the growing workforce, new opportunities in the workforce emerged for women as well. This encouraged women to seek political equality at the same time. Why do you think that would be the case? All right, so yeah, again, for those of you who are a little bit aware of the nature of women's rights throughout many civilizations, and in America, for example, prior to women being allowed to enter the workforce, they essentially lived very isolated lives for the most part. Many women didn't get out of their household very much, and they didn't have any economic or political opportunities. However, by this point, since women are now able to get more economic opportunities across the world, they're getting more involved in society, which encourages them to seek political opportunity as well. This led to the rise of suffragettes across the world, who were political activists who sought the right to vote. Particularly, of course, we're going to look at women's suffragists today. For example, in 1867, the National Society for Women's Suffrage was founded in Britain, one of the first, if not the first, organizations in the world for women's political equality. Amelia Pankhurst was also active between 1858 and 1928, who founded the Women's Social and Political Union in 1903 in Great Britain. Now, one thing that sets this group apart that's important to focus on is their use of civil disobedience to campaign. Now, can anyone tell me what civil disobedience is? Again, awkward pause. But yes, as many of you are probably aware, imaginary audience is not actually here right now, civil disobedience is where a political activist respectfully and peacefully, or at the very least peacefully, refuses to follow certain laws or certain ideas in order to protest some sort of political idea. So, of course, in this case, the women's female suffragists would refuse to follow certain laws in order to protest their lack of an ability to vote. Now, I think this is important to focus on for a second because why might it be relevant to our society? Alright, so again, I won't give it too big of a pause on this one because this one's probably very obvious. This is a big thing that's being focused on today because many people are sort of debating between the merits of civil disobedience and more direct and arguably violent means of protest. As I'm sure most of you know who are looking at the news, or unless you live under a rock, civil disobedience and more active violent protests are hotly debated today. Many people try to point to civil disobedience and its success as a civil rights movement as the idea that civil disobedience should be the main, if not only way, people protest and are politically active. Many people, however, don't want to be held back by what they see as the limitations of civil disobedience. Sorry, I'm very tongue-tied today. Yeah, many people don't want to be limited, as they would argue, by civil disobedience, and argue that protests shouldn't necessarily be civil, because if you're too civil, you don't accomplish anything. I'm, of course, not going to necessarily take a side on that today. That's up for you guys to decide. But I did want to make you aware that this sort of debate between civil disobedience and more direct forms of protest is nothing new. It's something that many protest groups, from women's rights to labor unions to racial equality groups, have had to struggle with for a long time. Now, to give you more of an idea of the international impact of female suffrage, it did spread fairly quickly across the world. In 1870, the French League of Women's Rights was formed. In 1894, the Union of Germany's Women Association organizations was formed, which you can see some members of here. And by 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed in the United States, which, if you don't know, was of course the amendment that gave women the right to vote in this country for the first time. Unless you count, I think, an amendment that was passed in New Jersey in actually the 1780s, which of course the men quickly got away with. That's a fun fact or / depressing fact, actually. There was a window of opportunity, but it did get snatched away very quickly. But anyway, a little bit about what cities were like as well. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the majority of the world lived in large families on farms. Why do you think that's the case? And again, what were the disadvantages of that system? Awkward pause again. But yes, this again goes back a little bit to the causes of the Industrial Revolution. Since this agricultural revolution had happened, food was now more abundant. People could focus on making new mechanical inventions. Before that, however, your main concern was just putting enough food on the table so you could survive. So because of this, most people live on farms in order to produce enough food to live, and they had these large families in order to make sure they had labor to survive. This, of course, led to some disadvantages since you didn't really have the time to produce anything else or to improve your life in any other major way, and if one harvest failed, your family was basically wrecked. However, this all changed during the Industrial Revolution. Less of the population was needed to farm, so more people could move to the cities. For example, only 30% now of the population in England was farmers by 1820. Less famine was also common because, again, food was more readily available. There was more of a surplus. So although of course hunger and starvation did still happen, it was less widespread. For example, the last major famine that's recorded to have occurred in Europe is an 1840s Ireland famine. Increased population was also a thing as well. For example, between 1750 and 1850, there was an 80% increase in European population. This was, of course, largely due to these advancements, allowing people to have more steady works and steady food supplies to live longer. The increased life expectancy also occurred as well. For example, in 1850, there was a 45-year life expectancy for women in Sweden, which was actually an 8-year increase in just 25 years. So, again, because of some of the surpluses and the advancements that were occurring during this time, many people's lives did improve overall. However, the rush to the cities did lead to a few disadvantages, as you might imagine. For example, many of these cities had no access to clean running water, primarily because they were unsanitary. To give you guys an example, I know this might show off a bit of how old I am, but did any of you play or the Oregon Trail like I did when I was a kid? Hopefully there's someone besides me. But yeah, if you have played the Oregon Trail, you might know that one of the most common ways to die in that game, of which I died many times, is cholera. Cholera was a byproduct of these unsanitary cities. Because as you can see in this picture, which is well illustrated, these city streets were not sanitary at all. Not only would they sometimes be filled with dead animals, but many of these cities, even in Europe in the 19th century, would just throw their waste into the street. Obviously not a very sanitary system. So because of this, diseases like cholera spread like wildfire. And if you don't know what cholera is, to put it somewhat crudely, it's essentially just a disease where you have diarrhea and it literally dehydrates you to death. Obviously a horrible way to go. For example, in 1823, there was a major epidemic in Russia. There was a major epidemic in 1832 in New York. And even by 1892, there was an infamous epidemic which led 250,000 dead. Some of these problems would eventually be fixed by reservoirs and underground pipes. Once sanitation systems sprung up in these cities, it of course helped cut back on disease. Bacteriologist Robert Koch, or however you say his name, as I mentioned, I'm terrible with pronunciation, in 1876 discovered that bacteria was what caused anthrax, and discovered that bacteria caused tuberculosis. This of course led to health reform, which made people healthier. Finally, by 1898, Ronald Ross had discovered that mosquitoes were what caused malaria. So this, of course, helped make people more healthy as well and prevented the spread of deadly diseases. Now, that's a very quick overview, of course, of the Industrial Revolution. Please, I recommend taking a more specialized history class in the future to give you a bit more detail, but that's just a quick overview on how society changed. As I mentioned, the last thing I want to focus on today are some of the major causes of World War I. In the interest of time, we'll just go over these very quickly, so hopefully you know a little bit about what we're going to discuss starting next week. What I'd like you to be prepared to discuss when class starts next week are some of the major causes of World War I. Be prepared to discuss why imperialism helped cause the war, why these mutual defense alliances you can see here helped cause the war, how militarism helped cause the war, and finally, how nationalism caused the war. But in the meantime, that's all I have for you today. Please make sure you again get prepared for these assignments this week and the next few weeks as soon as possible. If you have any questions, please let me know as soon as you can. But in the meantime, have a great rest of your week and try to enjoy your weekend. Have a great day.